Welcome to the Rocky Mountain MS Center's webinar series. This series is designed to give people with MS information to empower them to make the best choices for their lifelong brain health. I'm Kelsey Morrow, Education Manager for the Rocky Mountain MS Center, and I would like to thank the pharmaceutical companies who have provided support for this program. Thank you to Bristol Myers Squibb, EMD Serono, and Novartis Pharmaceuticals. This speaker series is just one piece of our education programming. We have a variety of formats available to you, including both in-person and online options, with most of our programs also available on demand through our YouTube channel. Our most recent videos are from the series Conversations on MS, which is a 90-minute town hall style Q&A with an MS specialist neurologist at the Rocky Mountain MS Center. You can join the next session live with Dr. Enrique Alvarez on October 29th, either online on Zoom or in person in Colorado Springs. On November 16th, we will host our Fall Education Summit featuring presentations on the new diagnostic criteria for MS, an update on the BTK trial results, aging healthier with MS, invisible symptoms, and a potential new treatment for MS called CAR-T. You can join us in person at Anschutz Medical Campus in Aurora or online via Zoom. We announce upcoming educational opportunities through our mailing list, our Facebook page, and you can sign up for notifications through Eventbrite. All of our education programs are free of charge to anyone interested. Today's presentation will explore the use and misuse of stem cell treatments for MS. Our presenter is Dr. Andrew Wolfe. Dr. Wolfe attended medical school at the University of Colorado Denver School of Medicine and completed residency and fellowships at the University of Colorado. His research interests are focused on improving the treatment of patients with MS and other inflammatory diseases of the central nervous system. Current projects include developing digital and blood biomarkers to detect worsening in MS patients, characterizing clinical outcomes of neuroinvasive West Nile virus infection in patients on anti-CD20 treatments, and understanding the risks of immune checkpoint inhibitor use in patients with neuroimmunological disease. He's also interested in the acute management of demyelinating diseases and optimizing inpatient to outpatient care transitions. This webinar features a lot of important information. If you missed something on a slide or want to hear it again, we are recording and it will be archived on our website, mscenter.org, so that you can replay it at any time. All live viewers will get the recording automatically sent to them. You will also receive a link to our evaluation survey. Please take a few minutes to fill this out to help us improve future programming. We'll reserve time at the end to answer questions from the audience. You can submit them at any time using the Q&A box on Zoom. We did have a large number of questions submitted at registration, many of which will be answered in today's presentation. We will answer as many additional questions as time allows. Today's presentation is for educational purposes only. With that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Wolfe.
All right, thanks so much to Kelsey for the introduction, and thanks to everyone for joining on the webinar. Like was said, my name is Andrew Wolfe. I'm one of the neurologists here at the Rocky Mountain MS Center. I definitely have developed a major interest for talking about stem cells, both of the potential positives and the negatives. So hopefully this will be some helpful information for everyone. So I'm going to go ahead and just share my screen real quick and we can get started. And like Kelsey was saying, so we did get a lot of questions during registration, and so I'm certainly happy to answer a lot of those throughout the presentation, and then at the end. And then if anyone has other questions in the chat, we will also work through those. So we should have plenty of time to answer as many as we can. So just as our topical overview here, so we're going to have a focus on multiple sclerosis. We will talk about stem cells in a little bit of a broader context, and we'll talk about how stem cells work, and then as well as how they may not work, or what sorts of downsides may come from these sorts of treatments, especially in different contexts with things like medical tourism. So just a few disclosures to start. None of these are directly relevant to the content for today's talk, but just different research and consulting and education funding from different private entities as well as pharmaceutical companies. So we were to put together some overarching objectives for the next 35 minutes or so. I'd like to first review the types of stem cell treatments that are utilized in an attempt to treat neurological diseases. And we're obviously are going to focus more on how that may apply to multiple sclerosis. We're then going to talk about contemporary practices with medical tourism and stem cell tourism. And so we'll talk a little bit as to why that's the case, that medical tourism is important in this context, as well as actually defining what that means. We'll talk about adverse events or bad outcomes that can happen from stem cell tourism and stem cell treatments in general. And then for you all as the patients or family members or friends of patients, we will talk about practical tips for if you hear about these things and you're wondering, is this, right for me? Should I pursue it? We will try to provide a way to help you make an informed decision. So we're going to follow an outline that's going to attempt to answer 5 major questions related to those objectives. So the first question, sort of sets the foundation for us, and that is, what is a stem cell? The second is, what sort of treatments may exist that are based on stem cell technology, or what sort of things are people working on that might eventually become effective treatments? We're then going to talk about medical tourism or stem cell tourism. We'll talk about the potential risks of that, those treatments, and then we will, then get to that final question: how can you evaluate stem cell treatments as a patient in a way that might, help you optimize your decision-making process? So I wanted just briefly, so we'll talk a little bit about this on the end as well, just an aside on HSCT, which is hematopoietic stem cell transplant. Just because this will have some content included on this, and then I added some slides at the end if we have time. But we're going to focus a little bit on other sorts of stem cell treatments for the purposes of today. And part of that, the reason for that is that we have covered HSCT or hematopoietic stem cell transplant previously in some talks from Dr. Amanda Piquet, one of my colleagues here. So that was at the Education Summit in the spring, and so that is archived and available on the MS Center website, mscenter.org, with the ability to stream on YouTube. So I will mention, just as, so what HSCT is ablating or killing the immune system. It's, similar to what would happen if someone had a blood cancer. So we kill all the immune cells in the blood, basically, and then use stem cells to sort of reboot the immune system. And the idea is that when you do that, whatever factors have led to MS, occurring in the immune system are then not present. So clinical trials are ongoing in the US, including Beat MS, which is a clinical trial that we are a site for at the University of Colorado Rocky Mountain MS Center for treatment of relapsing MS. The current evidence from a variety of sources would support that HSCT is an effective treatment for aggressive relapsing MS. At the moment, which is the question that Beat MS is attempting to answer, is that we are not certain if it is more effective than our conventional high efficacy therapies. So is it better than drugs like Ocrevus, which is ocrelizumab, Tysabri, which is natalizumab? There has not been a clinical trial to help understand that specific question in a robust way. The potential benefits of this, is it's a little bit of a different treatment paradigm than the conventional drugs. So at the moment, if someone goes on Ocrevus, for instance, for MS, they are frequently on that treatment and being immunosuppressed for many years. The idea behind HSCT is that you are immunosuppressed for a more profoundly, but for a shorter period, and then you may be treatment-free, but doing well from an MS standpoint. for several years. You may not need to be on perpetual treatment. The reason this comes up a little bit in the context of some of today's content is that HSCT is not particularly easy to access, especially in the United States, and there definitely are places outside of the US that will offer this treatment with different standards that often require cash payments in Mexico, India, Russia, others. And so there's not a lot of regulatory oversight that tells us that these transplants are being done with the same standards that would happen if they were done on our campus, for instance. Like I said, there's a few questions about this that we can help work through at the end. I think probably most importantly from this slide is that if you do have aggressive relapsing MS and you're potentially interested in a stem cell transplant, is to definitely reach out to us about this on Beat MS clinical trial. So if we move a little bit forward, even beyond HSCT and talk about what are we trying to accomplish with stem cell treatments in neurology. So of course, the first one is what we just mentioned. So we can basically destroy a overactive or malfunctioning immune system and then basically reconstitute it, hopefully more normally with stem cells. In MS, stem cells treatments have also been used in other fashions. So part of that is to modulate or down regulate or dampen inflammatory responses. So you could think that if stem cells are anti-inflammatory or certain types of stem cells are anti-inflammatory, we may be able to reduce the risk of relapses or to reduce the risk of progression where patients are slowly developing symptoms in MS. Stem cells probably historically have received the most attention for promotion of regeneration or repair. So you may think of if stem cells are developing the brain, for instance, if the brain has been damaged from MS, could we use stem cells to go in and sort of fix the problem, either by replacing injured cells, which we see actually in the next bullet, or releasing things like growth factors that may help the brain recover. And so there has been more studies of replacing injured cell populations, such as something that happens in Parkinson's with stem cells, where you literally will try to implant stem cells into the damaged part of the brain and hope that they then integrate to allow the brain or the spinal cord in other cases to function again. So there's a lot of different ways that it's proposed that these treatments may be helpful. So just to provide some background for us, so we, without first question on our outline was focused on what is a stem cell. So stem cells exist at the very earliest stage of development. So they are primitive cells. They have the potential to create, to maintain, or to repair different body tissues. They have key characteristics that they can self-renew, so they can divide and basically live perpetually as a cell population. They can also differentiate or grow or turn into other types of cells. So if we look at what we mean by that point, is that when stem cells exist in development, they can fall into different categories. So pluripotent stem cells, so those can become nearly any type of cell. So those can exist as embryonic stem cells. So during human development, there's a cell population that eventually will turn into many different types of tissue, whether that's blood, brain, fat, etc. You can also make these in the lab, so often using different biochemistry techniques from stem cells. You can create what's called induced pluripotent stem cells, which are actually very important for doing different types of experiments. We can also have multipotent stem cells, and so that comes up also very frequently, especially for treating different diseases. As we mentioned, so we have hematopoietic stem cells, so those end up forming the blood system, so something that's important for something like a bone marrow transplant. Mesenchymal stem cells, those are things that will form more connective tissues and muscle and bone. and then neural stem cells, which will form our central nervous system. So we'll talk about a few of these as besides hematopoietic stem cells, as far as how they may be used from a treatment standpoint. This is just a graphic that basically is a visual representation of that previous slide. So, basic question, what is a stem cell? It is a single cell that can replicate within the body to replenish, but it can also differentiate or turn into many different types of cells that will form tissues that are important for our function. So just, seeing different types of blood cells, a neuron, skin cells, et cetera, down in that graphic. So you can imagine that if we, can create new cells and new tissues, especially for repairing damage, that this is a very promising idea. So I think there's a few points that are often a little bit confusing as far as terminology. And this does play some role into how different treatments are allowed or not allowed to happen. Currently, I would first classify stem cell treatments into these two categories. So are they autologous or allogeneic? So autologous treatments are when cells are collected and then potentially processed and then used in the same person. So say, for instance, you had an autologous hematopoietic stem cell transplant or a bone marrow transplant. That means that your cells are being taken out and potentially processed and then given back just to you. And then allogeneic is when the cells are taken from a different person. So that there's not necessarily a whole bunch of that done for autoimmune diseases as far as with stem cell transplants. On like the bone marrow transplant side, it does happen. Typically this tends to have a risk of more side effects just because of the immune system response to cells from a different person. As far as other stem cell treatments, say we're just, taking neural stem cells or embryonic stem cells, a lot of those actually are allogeneic, just because you can imagine if you're a 55-year-old patient with MS and we're trying to treat you with an embryonic stem cell product, is that you do not have those cells existent just at your, stage of development. So we'll talk a little bit then about some of these subcategories of stem cells, just to clarify a little bit what they are. And so embryonic stem cells are one that a lot of people think about. So these exist, back in this thing called the inner cell mass that exists very early in development. This population will then divide and multiply. And then these cells will grow and form into many different types of tissues. So you can see the list of just some of those that are down there at the bottom. So we think of ectoderm, mesoderm, endoderm, and then germline cells. So all of these, will form different functional tissues in the body. So ectoderm being one that we think about as far as brain formation. And then there's some proposed potential diseases that may be treated with different sort of subpopulations of cells down at the bottom. So, MS would fall along with the other nervous system diseases over there on the left side. So macular degeneration, Parkinson's, and ALS. I think one of the challenges with this is that embryonic stem cells are often sort of promoted as that they are very smart, and that if we put just embryonic stem cells that are undifferentiated into your spinal fluid or into your blood, that they may just sort of know where to go and start to fix the damage. And the reality is that this does not really seem to be the case. So there was this nice quote from an editorial in the New England Journal of Medicine a few years ago, that the thought that stem cells are intrinsically or just naturally able to sense the environment and go repair whatever may be damaged is just not really based on good evidence. So that always makes us careful about not assuming that we're going to get certain results if we were to say to infuse this sort of stem cell. Neural stem cells are more restricted, and so we see the two, big ideas besides what neural stem cells may accomplish in this graphic here. So if we, call the red cell there in the middle a neural stem cell, it may have a few different roles. So as I mentioned, some of that may be replacing injured cells to repair damage in the brain or the spinal cord, and we can see that neural stem cells can grow into different types of cell types. So we think of all of these types of cells being important and potentially damaged in patients with MS to different degrees. Neural stem cells may also not go and replace damaged cells, but they may simply produce growth factors and things that may help with repair. They may produce these soluble factors that are anti-inflammatory. So we'll talk about a few studies that are focused on this, but this neural protection idea may actually be better supported as how these cells may be helpful, at least in the neurology context, versus actually replacing damaged cells. Mesenchymal stem cells are also something that can have more of a regulatory effect. So these cells come from a variety of sources that we can see over on the left side. But if we look at the graphic on the right, some mesenchymal stem cells existing up in the upper right-hand corner there. So again, if we look at that arrow with paracrine signaling, there's a thought that these cells will release factors that can go help to stimulate remyelination. Again, myelin being damaged is a key feature of MS. So we see that this may help that the oligodendrocytes, which are the cells that make myelin in the central nervous system, this may help them sort of repair damage to that sheath that helps with the neuron to send its signals to control our nervous system. These cells may also act through microglia or other types of cells in the immune system just to reduce inflammation. And so, again, these sort of signaling as opposed to replacing damage are, one of the big features of a lot of the current MS trials. So these are just sort of an overview of these cell types that we had talked about and sort of, how they may work, what are the potential advantages and what are the potential disadvantages. So we had talked through a few of these on the previous slides. I think the other thing to mention that I had briefly talked about is that sometimes it's more challenging to get certain types of these cells than others. There are often technical issues with inducing pluripotent stem cells. Again, those are the cells that can be made from other sorts of tissues. Embryonic stem cells, have to come essentially from embryos, so that that is not necessarily always easy to source. Hematopoietic stem cells, a little bit sometimes easier to obtain. And then we talked on the last two slides about mesenchymal cells and then neural stem cells. So those, are also important ones for us to think about. So we'll talk about a couple trials that have used mesenchymal and neural stem cells here in a minute. So these are two of the more recent trials that had received a good amount of press and were published in relatively prominent journals here for trying to treat MS with stem cell products. So the first one really tries to take the paradigm of how could we use stem cells to reduce inflammation due to the signaling properties of trying to dampen the overactive immune system. So this study took autologous, so coming from the same person, bone marrow-derived mesenchymal stem cells. And it was attempting to see, one, both was this safe? Would there be bad side effects? And then two, would it reduce the number of enhancing lesions on an MRI compared to a placebo? And so when we think about MS clinical trials, we are often thinking about a few outcomes that are important for us. One outcome is the MRI active or not? Are there new lesions? Are there gadolinium enhancing lesions? And then also we will often look at clinical outcomes. Are patients having disability progression? Are they having relapses? And so this was an MRI-focused study, which is very common just for smaller initial trials, just because it's a little bit easier to do in a shorter time period. And so these cells were processed. They were given through an IV. There were not any serious safety events, so this did seem to be safe and tolerable. But unfortunately, at 24 weeks, there was not any benefit seen as far as the development of these enhancing T1 gadolinium lesions on the MRI scan. So it did not look like we saw benefit on the primary outcome of was this reducing inflammation in MS, at least as measured by MRI. The other big paradigm is not so much, directly reducing inflammation, but, can these cells be neuroprotective, where they may help potentially with some degree of repair of the nervous system, or, reducing just damage in that neurodegenerative or slowly worsening process of MS. And so these were, again, autologous stem cells taken from the same patients. These were administered a little bit differently, which did impact the side effect profile. So these were delivered intrathecally, so into the spinal fluid through a lumbar puncture. These outcomes, this was a smaller study, but these outcomes were looking at something called the time 25-foot walk, which is exactly like it sounds. So it basically is a measure of how quickly a patient can walk 25 feet. And then also at some biomarkers in the spinal fluid that may be associated with neuroprotection. And so there were some modest improvements actually in these metrics at 28 weeks, which was the duration of the study. Potentially a outcome that deserves further study in larger clinical trials. There was rare arachnoiditis, which is just inflammation of the lining of the brain and spinal cord that was associated with treatment, and that was likely due to how these stem cell products were administered. So some potentially promising results, but something that is not advanced enough at the moment to be available outside of a clinical trial for clinical use. Another study that has received quite a bit of attention, that's a little bit more invasive, that is the one that we're going to talk about that used actual neural stem cells, is this phase 1 study of actually administering stem cells directly into the brain, basically via a catheter into the ventricles where there is spinal fluid. And so this study was basically taking allogeneic neural stem cells, so stem cells from other sources, and then administering them to patients with progressive MS. So, for a lot of you, as you know, progressive MS, where patients will have often slowly worsening development of disability, remains probably our biggest unmet need as far as treatment. So with our conventional therapies, we're typically quite good at reducing relapses, reducing new MRI activity. But for patients who have primary progressive MS or secondary progressive MS, our typical therapies are not, having as much of an impact at the moment. So the idea behind this, is that these cells would potentially reduce inflammation and basically slow down the disease process when they are administered into the brain, essentially. And so this was, as I said, was a phase 1 study. So it was small, as predominantly looking at safety outcomes. There were not any major safety concerns from this study. We're actually expecting some publication in the near future about some longer term safety outcomes from this group. And they did look at some biomarkers, again, looking at things in the spinal fluid as far as biochemistry levels of different products that may be associated with neuroprotection. And it did look like there was some response basically dependent on dose. So patients here received different numbers of neural stem cells, and the biomarkers tended to change more when patients got more cells, so potentially a positive outcome, but this will need to be followed in larger studies for us to better understand is this actually working, and how might the long-term safety look like, but definitely a very interesting study. We're going to pivot a little bit, now that we hopefully sort of outlined what sort of things are out there as far as stem cell treatments, just to discuss medical tourism, because I think, something that's important, that hopefully we gave a little bit of a sense of, is that there's a ton of research being done in this area, as far as different types of stem cell treatments, but all of it is a very early phase. So none of those things are approved by the FDA. So they're not, currently available for patients, in the US in most circumstances. So that does not mean, however, that they cannot potentially be received in different fashions, outside of the US. So medical tourism is something that has really exploded, in part due to marketing, since the internet and social media became really ubiquitous. But medical tourism is the practice of traveling across borders, so internationally, to receive medical treatment. And so this is not just patients in the US, say, for instance, traveling to Russia or Mexico or the UK, but this also includes patients from elsewhere traveling to the US. In fact, the patients traveling to the US for different types of medical treatment is probably the biggest market of all, just because of the ability to pay privately in our healthcare system. So you may ask, why would people want to participate in medical tourism? And there are a variety of different motivations. So part of it is more affordable or more timely treatment. So you can imagine in countries where there may be more healthcare rationing, that if you are able to pay, to move up your knee surgery, that you may travel outside of that country to do that more quickly. Things may be more affordable in other countries. Access to proven treatments may not be available in someone's home country. So, just for instance, some of our multiple sclerosis treatments are not available in some countries. So theoretically, could someone come to the US and get that treatment? Absolutely. And then access to unproven treatments in different regulatory environments. So, this is really the one that I think is most important for us in the stem cell context. So a lot of these treatments are not proven to work. We don't have a full understanding of their safety. In the US, a lot of these things are frequently either shut down or strongly discouraged by entities like the FDA. But that is not true in every country, where they may be a little bit more flexible as far as what may be allowed. Medical tourism is typically not something that conventional insurance is going to pay for. We'll talk a little bit about red flags towards the end, as far as if you're considering things like this. But for stem cell transplants, for instance, that are received outside of the US, some of my patients have paid about $150,000 cash to receive that. I've also had patients get stem cell injections for different reasons that maybe up to $18,000 or $20,000. So in some cases, this medical tourism makes a lot of sense. Again, say for instance, you cannot get a surgery that is well validated and evidence-based quickly enough, and you end up going somewhere else to get it. But there are extreme challenges when treatments are offered that are not proven to work. or best practices are not upheld. And so I think it's always important to think about that the standards as far as the laboratory, the cleanliness, the physician training, the nursing, et cetera, in different places are not always up to the same standards as we may expect here in Colorado. So there's a group of medical tourism called stem cell tourism. So basically just pursuit of stem cell treatments like we talked about. This has been very important for neurodegenerative diseases, again, due to that focus on trying to repair the nervous system, so including MS. If we look at this study from a few years ago, if we looked just at the clinics that were captured, we see that as neurologists, we are having a lot of patients as far as indications that come up for pursuing stem cell tourism. We see MS, number one, at least in this study. And these stem cell products are being offered, all over, both inside and outside of the US in different contexts, although certainly more aggressive and expansive offerings outside of the US. And I just really, want to hammer home this point. So there are no FDA-approved treatments that are regenerative stem cell treatments for neurological disorders. So anything that is being offered at the moment, either inside or outside of the US, has not been formally evaluated and approved by the FDA. So basically meaning that there's not really great safety or efficacy evidence. So just to mention that, so we were sort of a hotspot on this 2017 survey for stem cell clinics operating in the US. You can see Colorado there in sort of the medium to dark blue. The reason that some of these products are offered, the vast majority of them not being offered for neurological reasons in the US, is that some of these therapies do not have to have the same safety and efficacy studies and clinical trials like we talked about for those other stem cell therapies that are currently being evaluated for MS. And so most of that is, again, if they're autologous. So if the stem cells are being taken from a person and then used with minimal manipulation for that same person, so not being taken and processed heavily in the lab, then they do not have to have as much robust study, because that is thought to be relatively lower risk. The other challenge, because neither that nor this next point applies to anything that is done outside the US, is that stem cells are still regulated in the US to try to reduce the introduction, transmission, or spread of infections, which is communicable diseases. And so that is really important. Again, I just want to hammer home that there are some stem cell products that you could get in the US that would technically fall, under this guidance. Predominantly those are things that are used in orthopedics, for instance, like platelet-rich plasma and other things. But the vast majority of things is like embryonic stem cells, placental stem cells, neural stem cells that you may see marketed from an MS standpoint, are really not fitting within this criteria. And all of them, though, should still be regulated to help make sure that they are not spreading infections. Stem cell clinics appear to still be quite common. So we see this follow-up study from 2021. We see again that Colorado is sort of a hotspot for these clinics, especially on a per capita basis, compared to other states. There are some ongoing concerns here, some essentially turf wars between the FDA and individual states. Utah recently, earlier this year, did attempt to have some legislation that would allow placental stem cell therapies to happen. That is contrary to the FDA guidance. There have been some other legislation in Texas, Mississippi, North Carolina, with some certain stipulations that may also allow some forms of stem cell treatments to occur. The concerning features here, so Utah legislation does not require a physician to be in charge of sort of managing the treatment, nor does it require any sort of vetting as far as how the product is made, any sort of standards for safety, cleanliness, or effectiveness. And so the fact that stem cell treatments may be offered to you as a patient in the US does not mean that it works, that it is safe, or that has been studied or approved by the FDA. Despite that, stem cells are often marketed aggressively. So these were some images I took from earlier this year. So, using typical tactics as far as like celebrity endorsements, marketing that stem cells can work and treat, all sorts of different diseases, which we see on the upper right, that there's, really no evidence that these treatments help for any of these diseases. They certainly could, but those has not been proven in clinical trials, and we see MS and a few other neurological diseases listed on there. And then we see, this really sort of hitting this like tourism component of stem cells being, sold both for cosmetic and for medical purposes, but with these all-inclusive packages with transportation, lodging, et cetera. So, group rates available. So, definitely things that are trying to entice, but not, really having a lot of, evidence to underlie these claims. So I think the challenges, for us is that, as patients, people are often highly motivated to seek out any treatment that might work due to the limits of what we have to offer. So again, getting back to that point of progressive MS, as a field, we are not, great at treating that disease. Patients may have, very significant, disability. And so it is certainly understandable to try to, want to push the envelope a little bit to try to get more effective treatments. Because of the regulatory environment, so treatments can be marketed aggressively, and there's not a lot of pushback from that, and the risks are often minimized. There may be a chilling effect on enrollment in controlled trials. So what I mean by that is that if we have a clinical trial here at the University of Colorado, and half of the patients might get the stem cell treatment and half of them may get a placebo, but you could go and pay for what is promised to be a stem cell treatment, somewhere else. That may have people not enroll in a clinical trial because they want to get, quote unquote, the sure thing. So that is certainly an issue. One concern that's often overlooked a little bit is that receiving stem cell treatments like this can result in basically you not being able to participate in other clinical trials. And that's just because of the potential confounds that we don't really know what these stem cells may do. And we don't really know what they are because they are not regulated. So there's not a lot of safety monitoring of these products. We don't understand exactly sometimes how they are manufacturing or that you're even getting stem cells. And we cannot really confirm that the different products across institutions are even the same. So there's a variety of risks that are very well described from stem cell treatments and stem cell tourism. So we see this list here of infections, other nervous system problems, and certainly death as also an outcome. This is probably quite underreported just because we don't have a way to track these things like we would with a pharmaceutical, study or a registry. But this is a very real concern of several hundred patients having very serious complications and quite a few actually dying from this sort of treatment. One of the things that, had us here interested in this as an issue is this patient case, one of my patients from a year ago. So this patient received embryonic stem cells that were quote unquote programmed to treat MS. There is no evidence that these stem cells could be programmed to treat MS. There's also no evidence that this patient actually received stem cells. as opposed to something else in this administration. Unfortunately, the stem cell product was presumably contaminated with this unusual bacteria called Mycobacterium abscessus. And so this patient, unfortunately, trying to treat their MS, ended up getting a need for 5 antibiotics for 12 months and was hospitalized several times with meningitis. So definitely something, if you're thinking about traveling abroad, to talk with your doctors about, as recommended there by the CDC. These sorts of infections can also occur outside of the brain. So we just see that mentioned just with this same bacteria. There was actually an outbreak from contamination that caused a variety of other infections that our colleagues at National Jewish here in town described. As far as some of the highlights of some of the more unusual complications that can occur, so this one got some attention a few years ago, but if we look at these arrows on this MRI scan, we can actually see a tumor growing along the spinal cord. So this patient had received intrathecal or intra-CSF stem cell injections. And then over on the right, we see with these arrows on the right side, the tumor growing along the spinal cord. And so just, to highlight, we don't always understand, what different cell types are going to do when we inject them or put them in places that they are not normally. So, this was actually very challenging to treat this tumor because it did not, it was a stem cell tumor. It did not respond the way that, typical tumors would work. This is a similar case. So with the arrows, we can see also masses or tumors that developed after neural stem cell transplantation to try to treat this patient's ataxia. So definitely, some very concerning negative outcomes in addition to, things like simple infections. So important to think through, how may you evaluate stem cell treatments? So is the treatment routine for the patient's specific disease? What are the possible benefits and how long will it take to see the results? What sort of scientific evidence is out there and has it been published, which is really important that there's been some amount of peer review because otherwise people can, sort of say whatever they want. What are the risks of the procedure? Is there an IRB? So especially for something like a clinical trial, an IRB is very important for overseeing the safety and the scientific validity of a study. And is the product approved? And so these questions come from the International Society for Stem Cell Research, which is a very, has a great website that I'll put a link to later. That is a group that promotes stem cell education. These are the red flags. So these are things that should give you a lot of hesitation, if you're thinking about one of these sorts of treatments. So these being rushed to make decisions, having to pay to be in a clinical trial, that is not something that, would happen here at the University of Colorado, not receiving informed consent documentation. Like I showed on that other slide, multiple diseases being treated with the same stem cell products. Claims that regulatory approval is not needed, claims that there is not risk of the treatment. Every single treatment that we use in medicine for any reason has some degree of risk. So these are all things to keep in mind if you are in this situation. So these are some validated resources here. So as I mentioned, so About Stem Cells is a great website that has a lot of a very strong quality information. The National MS Society is another, great place to get answers from. And then your neurologist or your other doctors should always be willing to help you, work through understanding different things here. And so there is a unlimited amount of unvalidated material online. So I'd always just be, careful about what sources you have. And if you're ever not sure, reach out to your physician about that. So just to have some conclusions, so stem cell treatments have a lot of promise for MS and other diseases, but at the moment are still very limited in their evidence as far as safety and efficacy, and none of them are approved by the FDA. There's a very broad spectrum of risks, and some of those risks can actually be life-threatening. Stem cell tourism, complicates those concerns as there's even less oversight about, how things are working or the safety. Stem cell treatments can be offered in limited contexts inside of the US, but would recommend avoiding those if they're not part of a clinical trial. And if you're thinking at all about pursuing one of these treatments, please talk to your neurologist and make sure that you have answers to those questions that I mentioned. So I want to thank everyone for your attention. We'll see what questions we have in the chat. I'll try to run through these on the paper. I think we ran a little bit longer than I anticipated, but I can hang out and sort of try to answer as many of these as possible. And then if you have any questions or you're thinking about stem cell treatments and you have concerns and you're not sure where to go, please feel free to just shoot me an email, and that's my address on there. So I'm gonna just stop this here for a second. Okay.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Wolf. We will move into the Q&A portion now. And just a reminder, we did have a large volume of questions submitted at registration. So we'll be grouping similar questions together. And again, many of the questions were answered during the presentation. So please, we're going to try not to repeat too much during the Q&A, but this is available on YouTube or will be next week. And then we're also unable to answer overly specific and situational questions since this webinar is just for educational purposes and is not medical advice. Dr. Wolf, we only had one question submitted in the live chat, asking if stem cell transplant is effective for secondary or primary progressive MS or being restricted to relapsing remitting.
Yeah, so it's a good question. I think we had that a few times, I think, in the submitted questions. The answer is that there's not really a lot of evidence that it is effective for progressive MS. So most of the focus at the moment, including in the clinical trial that we are part of, which is BEAT MS, is focused on relapsing disease. And part of that may be the different types of inflammation that are important at different stages of the disease. So there was some data at ECTRIMS, which is one of the big MS conferences a few weeks ago, looking at experience in the United Kingdom about stem cell transplants that included relapsing and progressive patients. That has not fully been published, but again, the thought is mostly that we think of benefit for relapsing disease just when we're in more of this acute inflammation stage. So I'm just going to work through a little bit of these. So I'll try to talk through some of the ones first that are about stem cell transplant. There's a question that says, is stem cell therapy close to what Ocrevus and Mavenclad do by killing of cells? And the answer is in a lot of ways, yes, especially for Mavenclad, and then for anyone who has heard about Lemtrada, which is alemtuzumab. So those are what we call immune reconstitution therapies. So they basically try to kill parts of the immune system and then hope that when it recovers, that the immune system does not have the same profile to cause inflammation. So that is, often very similar to how we think stem cell transplant works. Ocrevus is increasingly being studied as an immune reconstitution treatment, but right now it is not how with the treatment is really considered. So we, at the moment, we think of Ocrevus more as, sort of a perpetual, like ongoing treatment. We were to look 10 years into the future, we might be using it for shorter time periods just because it's depleting those white blood cells. There's a question about insurance and stem cell treatments. So there are insurance plans that will, in different contexts, they're all very, very different, cover stem cell transplantation like HSCT. You have to dig sort of into the minutia of what criteria may need to be met for that to be accomplished. Insurance plans are not almost ever going to cover things like the other sorts of stem cell treatments that we talked about, just because of the lack of evidence and lack of FDA approval. There's a question about how would someone register for stem cell trials, and so that at least at the University of Colorado, if you're seen here, if you talk to your or message your neurologist, they should be able to put you into the research database. If you are not a patient here, you're also free to reach out to us. We can maybe send out that information. But just as far as trials here, if not, at the University of Colorado, you can certainly find clinical trials on a website, which is clinicaltrials.gov, G-O-V, and that will list all studies that are currently registered as clinical trials in the US. And usually those will have a place to contact a coordinator who helps manage the trial at wherever site that is being run. So those are ways to sort of, try to get in touch with people. For Beat MS, which is that study that we are part of, there's also a website if people are outside of Colorado. If you just Google Beat MS clinical trial, that website will have contact information for different study personnel. Let's see. So I got a question about how effective are stem cell patches sold on the internet, such as LifeWave. The answer to that is that we do not, really have any robust data on if these things are safe or effective. So I typically try to avoid things that have not been evaluated in clinical trials or are approved by the FDA. But I don't know, I've not had patients on that specific product, but I do know that it has not been, fully evaluated. There's a question about stem cell implants or stem cell injections for arthritis and bulging discs. So that, sort of falls under the orthopedic side of things. So those are the sort of procedures that sometimes are actually allowed to happen, per the FDA guidance. I'm not, super familiar with, how many studies have been done as to if those work or not. But that is offered even at different places, sometimes like the University of Colorado. So a little bit different, I think, than what we had talked about. There's a question. It says, I was diagnosed with transverse myelitis in 2021. A month later, I was told I have relapsing MS. I'm very interested in stem cell therapy. I would like to know why it is not more readily offered to those of us in the US. And why you must fail 3 DMTs in order to qualify in most cases. So it's a good question. So, stem cell therapies, as far as like the regenerative therapies to fix damage, like we talked about, we just don't know, what works and what the safety profile looks like. So that is, predominantly why that is not offered by reputable centers outside of a clinical trial setting. As far as stem cell transplantation, like an HSCT, it's a little bit different based on different insurance about having to fail 3 disease-modifying therapies. So, part of that is just related to cost, and then the comparative effectiveness. So HSCT, requires hospitalization. It's very intense. It's extremely expensive. So that's one reason that it does not typically happen, up front. We also are not sure, which again, getting back to Beat MS, we are not sure at the moment, is a stem cell transplant more effective than a drug like Ocrevus? And so that, that question is hopefully going to be answered with the Beat MS study. There is a lot of retrospective data, meaning data taken from this, what's called a registry, where different outcomes are captured, called the MS base. And so that the goal of that was to try to look at patients that were matched for similar characteristics, age, how bad their MS was, how long they had had the disease, and to look and see, did patients do better with stem cell transplantation? Did they do better with different medications? And that did demonstrate that it looked like stem cell transplant was better than some of our MS drugs, which is not necessarily surprising. With Gilenya, which is fingolimod, one of the oral therapies, not a bad medicine, a very solid MS treatment. It did look like stem cell transplant was, quite a bit more effective at reducing relapse risk, for instance. as well as progression of symptoms. With Ocrevus, the numbers and the time for follow-up were much smaller, but we did not, in that study, see that there was a significant difference. So in that case, it is just not, clear what the best path forward is. Let's see, we talked a little bit about smoldering MS and progression. So, there is a thought with progressive MS that stem cells might just impact the inflammatory environment to reduce disease progression. But if you think back to that study of the intraventricular or injections into the brain of neural stem cells, but that is not, proven to work at the moment. I got a few questions about stem cell treatments for MS at places in the US. It says, this one says, there are 2 stem cell centers in Chicago, specifically for MS. Would they be recommended? And I would say I would not recommend that. I would be, very wary just based on the lack of evidence and safety data about getting any treatment with stem cells for MS outside of a clinical trial. And then the same thing applies to this next question. It says, are stem cell treatment centers outside of the US reputable and safe? If so, how do their treatments rank against some other ones globally? And I would say, again, we don't have the oversight, to know if what you're getting is what you are promised. And we also, even if it is, we don't know if it is safe and we don't know if it works. So I, pretty strongly recommend against those things to my patients, but definitely is worth a longer, discussion with your neurologist or your other doctors about that. But I would be, very wary about pursuing that. Let's see. I got, would you need to be newly diagnosed with MS? And that, is similar. So that tends to be, probably the time that we think more about, aggressive disease being treated with stem cell transplant is in patients that have a lot of relapses that are maybe not being controlled fully. And then let's see. Is stem cell treatment available now? So the answer is no, but it's in clinical trials. Will it be available soon? I am not sure. I am hopeful that we will have some traction with things that actually work effectively. The other question, how long can we expect stem cell treatments to work for? And the answer to that is also we don't know, because we haven't proven that they work. So we don't know if you would have to keep getting them or not. The exception to that is with stem cell transplant, where it appears that it does have some positive benefits, at least for several years, as far as reducing relapses. But we do not necessarily think of it as curative. So there are a substantial minority of patients that tend to still have relapses or MRI activity despite having a stem cell transplant. Depending on the study, it may be up to 20% or so at 5 years. So it's not perfect. And that gets into our question about success rate for HSCT and MS. We didn't comment specifically on safety other than just mentioning that HSCT is dangerous just because it kills the immune system pretty profoundly and can also cause some other abnormalities temporarily with the blood system. At times the rate of mortality or dying during the acute phase of a stem cell transplant has been as high as like 1 in 200 patients. So it is definitely not a trivial risk. Now, there can be arguments made that if you have a relatively high risk of something happening in the short term, but then you are not suppressing the immune system and you're not being treated for many years, and the MS is not getting worse, that may be worth it, and that certainly may be true for certain patients. But that is really why we want to be very careful about only pursuing that sort of treatment in the place that has the most experience and the very best standards of practice and training for the physicians and all the other staff. So that is why we get very worried about doing that sort of thing in an environment where there's not the same standards and safeguards that we have here. Let's see, what else do we have here? Okay, I think we answered most of these. Okay, there's a few questions just about timing and cures, and I think, yeah, we're very hopeful that some of these things will end up being beneficial, but I think it's right now hard to sort of know like when we may see some of this stuff work, and then how long it might take to be integrated into clinical practice. But that is what we're excited about continuing to work on.
I did have one more question submitted regarding the point of, are there stem cells in teeth? And if so, is it a good idea to keep kids' teeth? What conditions, and how about adult teeth?
Ooh, I don't know specifically if there are like harvestable stem cells in teeth. I could certainly look that up, but I don't know off the top of my head. I would suspect I have not heard of that as a major source of stem cells. Like I said, stem cells can sometimes be induced from different tissues, like the skin. So it's possible there may be some tricks to turn different cells back into stem cells, but I'm not 100% sure about that.
Excellent. Well, thank you for your time, Dr. Wolf. Thank you for the additional time to go through all those Q&A questions. Thank you all for submitting questions. Just a reminder, this will be archived on mscenter.org and YouTube. And please make sure that you are signed up for our mailing list in order to receive notifications about future programming. Thanks, and have a wonderful day.
All right. Yeah. Thank you, everyone.